Good evening, viewers. I have an interesting and perhaps a worrying story to share with you today. There is some building concern about the defense budgets in India. Now, don't get me wrong, India is not a small spender on defense. We are, in fact, the number 5 spender on defense in the entire world after the US, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and then comes India with $52.5 billion US dollars that we spend every year. Now that makes us ahead of the UK, France and Germany when spending on defense. But to spend approximately a third of what China's total defense budget is right now should be worrying, given the immediate threat that China perhaps poses. Like I said, there have been several reports that have come out lately, and let's take, for example, what's happening with the army. Now, the army has a total annual budget this year at least of 1,53,875 crore rupees, and that money is spent largely on salaries. 63% of that money goes into salaries, 20% into maintenance and operations, 3% into infrastructure, and 14% on modernization. Now, here's where the problem begins to arise. According to a representative of the army, the allocation to modernization this year is, and I quote, grossly inadequate because it needs to be at least 22 to 25% or we will be found wanting. Now, there have been a series of reports pointing to budget deficits in our armed forces, but these reports are normally completely ignored by the politicians who run this country. The same people who asked for these reports in the first place. Now, the equipment within the Indian Army falls into 3 categories, and this is interesting. Vintage, which is about 30-odd years old, current, and state-of-the-art. Now, there should be a split of a third to each, but we've learned that vintage, which is the really old equipment, is 68% of the equipment that our army has. 24% is current, and only 8% is state-of-the-art. And that's where the equipment is right now. Now, our Finance Minister Arun Jaitley could be called a very generous man because if you remember in our budget in February, he hiked the budget for the defense by 7.81%. Again, we need to ask, is it enough? An increase of 7.8%, according to representatives of the army, gets largely chewed up by salary increases under the 7th Pay Commission. And it doesn't even cater for inflation under operations and maintenance. The parliamentary committee has placed a report before the parliament. And in that report, it basically said that the army had asked for an allocation, and what the government actually gave the army had a 23% deficit. The army itself has been quoted saying this to parliament, that the current budget is not supportive of the inevitable needs of the army. In fact, the report notes, and this is the army speaking to the government, the report notes that China has become increasingly assertive, that modernization in both Pakistan and China is going on full swing, that China is competing to reach the levels of US. And as a country, should that worry us? Should China actually worry us? Let's take a look at some comparisons between China and India. The defense budget in China is 4 times the defense budget in India. According to a report by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, China increased its spending on defense in 2016-17 by 25%. In the same year, India increased its spending by 2.4%. The army in China has 600,000 more active soldiers than India does. China has 1,200 tactical aircrafts, while India has a little over 700. China has 55 more cruisers, destroyers and frigaters than India does. Altogether, the Parliamentary Committee on Defence has called this an agonizing state of affairs. Should we also be agonized? Admiral Arun Prakash, the former chief of the Indian Navy, has said that India faces serious shortages in its defence planning system. It's highly slow and inefficient, and that all of the unspent money lapses. He says, and I quote, a large portion of the defense budget is spent on revenue, like salaries, and very little is spent on modernization and re-equipment. How all these issues are actually affecting the Indian Army, Navy, and Air Force actually can be boiled down to basic categories. In the army, for example, the army has said they have trouble procuring equipment. They have trouble right now constructing strategic roads near the Sino-India border, which is something that needs to happen immediately, but there isn't enough money. For the Navy, procurement of ammunition and spares and serviceability of ships, submarines and aircraft turns out to be a problem because they're trying to keep up with aging infrastructure. And in the Air Force, there's an inability to procure spares, an inability to procure fuel. Maintenance and training of the fleet and serviceability is also effective. Now, this is not the first report, and it's unlikely to be the last. Most of these reports lie unattended in the dusty cabinets of the government offices. But at the same time, remember, our soldiers are at the border. We're having air crashes on a regular basis because of technical failures in aircraft. This is a battle or a question that comes up for every government. It's guns versus butter. Or put simply, how much should we actually spend on defense? Given the fact that so many people in our country are going hungry, a third of our population are going hungry, should we be spending on defense or should we be spending on food? Are our armed forces being neglected by our government? To give you a quick statistic, we spend a little over 1.5% right now on defense, 1.5% of our total GDP. This is perhaps a low number, given that it used to be higher than 3% at one point. Now, this is not a subject for debate. This is a subject we need to understand. So at Mirror Now today, we've taken a great deal of trouble to put together a panel that will help us all understand how difficult this problem really is, and if it needs the attention of the citizens and the government of India. Joining me on the show today, Vice Admiral Suresh Bangara, who's been responsible for the plans and the budgets of the Navy. Lieutenant General Dr. D.B. Shekatkar, the chairman of the committee recently appointed by the Government of India for reorganization of defense and rebalancing of the budgets. Maruf Raza is a defense expert and a strategic affairs expert. And Air Marshal M. Mateshwaran, who is a very, very senior Air Force officer, was also responsible for budgeting within the Air Force. Gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to invite you onto this program, and I thank you for making time. I'm going to start with Maruf Raza. Maruf, this is obviously for the average citizen a complicated subject. It's also, and I must point out, not a problem that came up in the last 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. It's a problem we've dealt with perhaps since the 80s. But do you think that right now our forces are suffering?
Well, Faye, at the outset, let me convey my respectful compliments to all the other panelists who are all senior to me and have given me the opportunity to speak before them. But since you've asked me the first question, let me try and sum up the problem from a layman's perspective, how we need to understand it. Today, we are at a situation where the defense budget and funding is probably touching as low a figure as was just before the Chinese invasion of 1962, when we were humiliated, and the services have been crying themselves hoarse to say we need more funding. Now, what funding is really required? You've given a very elaborate context in which we need to explain. You see, the problem is between must have and could have. So what is critical funds required for critical equipment that must be given to the armed forces? For example, there is this ongoing debate about the armed forces, the army in particular, getting rifles, because the bulk of our day-to-day combat requirements are either on the LOC or in Kashmir Valley or in the Northeast, is essentially soldiers with their rifles and some supporting equipment. General Shekatkar would be very familiar with that, being also an infantryman. But there is also the bigger question that the Prime Minister recently raised in front of the panel of the senior military commanders to say, you can't have expansion of the manpower and your role, and you can't have modernization at the same pace at the same time, because we are a country with limited funds available. Now, the problem there, therefore, that is the central problem, that whether we should expand or whether we should modernize. Now, both are essential, and they can only be addressed if we have a centralized body which will answer these questions for the parliamentarians and the politicians. We don't have an apex body which really spells it out. We have a lot of ad hocism. The 3 service officers will be able to explain that. I understand it, but they will also comment on it. The problem is centrally, we don't, even now having set up a defense planning committee, it is a good move, but it will take time for it to deliver. And therefore, we don't have a doctrine. And if you don't have a comprehensive doctrine for the 3 services, you cannot then buy stuff which can be interlinked with the requirements of the 2 services, say, operating in Jammu and Kashmir, the Air Force and the Army. Or you cannot have equipment that the Army and the Navy can use together in the Gujarat side of the front. So you have to have a comprehensive picture that is drawn out by a body which spells out a national doctrine. So the army is going to go out for battle on its own. The Air Force will be fighting a war on its own, and the Navy will also be ready to patrol the high seas on its own. So, you know, we spend money. It's not that India doesn't. It could spend a lot more. I would personally argue that the Parliamentary Committee of the 90s and subsequently has said 3% is a minimum that we can afford to spend. Now, if you're down to 1.6%, we have to ask ourselves questions. Are we considering our sovereign territorial defense an important aspect, or is it only lip service that politicians pay in election rallies? And every political party is responsible for the dismal state of affairs that we are in today.
Right. I want to take this first question right now to Lieutenant General Dr. D.B. Shegatkar. I'm very happy to have you on the show, Lieutenant General Shegatkar. The report that we were looking at today in the Times of India said that India needed about 800,000 rifles, but we're actually only going to get 250,000 rifles. Is this the kind of thing that we're going to have to worry about? Can we prioritize these things? Explain to us what this would mean for the servicemen at the border who are currently serving. The fact that we're talking about bulletproof jackets and rifles that we're not able to order and get on time.
Let me compliment you and your channel for giving this introduction. I can make out a lot of research work had been done. So my congratulations to you.
Thank you, sir.
Secondly, for taking up this topic itself. Thirdly, let me make quick points. Defense, national security and foreign policy do not fetch votes. And in India, which doesn't fetch votes, has got the least importance. Secondly, in politics, in diplomacy, in warfare, preparation for war and during conduct war, to speak the truth is to commit harakari, that is suicide. Thirdly, capacity building for anything, including the warfare or the war, takes time. Once your capacity goes up, your capability improves. Once your capacity and capability has improved, your endurance improves, and that is what Maruf Raza was trying to explain to you. I compliment him on this issue. Coming straight to this point, you mentioned what is important, bread or butter, or you want bread or the weapons. If you are not a secured nation, let me assure you, and through your channel, the entire nation itself, you cannot be secured. And if you are not secured, then everybody will take liberty with you, as they are doing in last 20-35 years. Capacity building has taken time. We have got the point is, preparation for war takes time. If you are not prepared for a war, you will get sucked into the war at the place and time and the circumstances which will not be of your choosing. That is what we have suffered. Maruf mentioned about it in 62, we suffered in 65, we suffered in Kargil, and we are suffering even today in Kashmir, because our adversary and our enemy both, they know that we are not prepared for a war. They know everything is. And therefore, this issue is very important. You mentioned about the rifles. What a shame. It is disgraceful that a nation like India, the ordnance factories, the DRDO cannot produce a weapon to be used by infantrymen on the line of control on the border. You claim you are producing missiles thanks to Dr. Kalam. It is a single-handed one. Have we produced a tank? Have we produced a gun? And don't we feel ashamed that we don't have a rifle to be produced by our own people to be what? And therefore we are importing. I have mentioned all these points in the committee report of the expert committee on reorganization of defense and defense budget. The reason being, Indian Army is the only army in the world, and thereafter maybe Pakistan Army to some extent, and Chinese Army, which fights in mountains, which fights in high altitude, which fight in the most difficult terrain in the world. And therefore, no other country can help you in fighting your war. You have to fight your own war. You cannot outsource your war, you cannot outsource your national security, as we are planning to do. Oh, they will help us, nobody will help. Final point on this issue is, if you take last 40 years, without exception, every finance minister on the floor of parliament has said, we will give everything to the armed forces when the time comes. When the time comes, you will not be there. My friend, you will not be there. The nation will be there, the national interest will be there, the armed forces will be there, and you will suffer. So you will be accountable, nor your people who help you, the governing mechanism will be accountable. The accountability will come on the chief of the army, navy, air force, whosoever is at that time. The accountability will come on the poor soldier. We are losing every second day. What a shame, what a disgrace. Every second day we are losing our man. Don't we feel ashamed? We can keep giving lectures, we can keep making statements, we can keep going heavier than the world. Don't we feel ashamed as a nation? Because our adversary and our enemy, both they know. It will be wrong to call both enemy. No, there is one enemy and one adversary. They know that we are not capable of fighting a war today. And that is what my point is, that if you wish to prevent a war, be prepared for it. Unfortunately, irrespective of what statements have been made, what press conferences have been held, what discussion, the ground reality is totally different. Ground reality is totally different.
Right. My next question is to Admiral Bangara. Admiral Bangara, good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm quoting right now Admiral Arun Prakash, who was the former chief of the Indian Navy, who said that we have huge problems in India when it comes to budgeting. He said, despite being the 5th largest defense spender and the world's largest arms importer, India faces serious shortages. India's defense planning system is highly slow and inefficient, and long delays in the Ministry of Defense means that allocated money is not spent within the year and then the money lapses. Do you agree with him that we have serious systemic problems right now, and that's the issue?
Yes, Faye, thank you very much. I have seen his statements. We were together in the Navy. I want to talk about just not facts and figures, but the structural weakness that he addressed. Now, if I had to explain the structural weakness in the system, which will inhibit any corrective measures that can be taken, then I think Mr. K. Subramaniam, who headed the Kargil Review Committee, said once, and I quote, politicians enjoy power without responsibility. Bureaucrats wield power without accountability. And the military assumes responsibilities without any direction. That brings me to Maruf's first point. Is there a security strategy outlined by the government to its armed forces? There has never been one. I think Arun Prakash also mentioned that. If you do not have a strategy outlined, then who plans with the amount that he gets every year? For example, this is not the first time that the parliamentary committee or the vice chiefs have made presentations. I have been in this business in the 90s, from 93 and then again in the late 90s, 93 and then again in the late 90s in plans and budgeting. And I can tell you there are umpteen similar things to say about the defense. And the vice chiefs have had similar things to say, that the budget is inadequate. Now you would say, what's the point in the parliamentary committee working every year and saying the same thing, it gets filed away? Because they have no teeth. Here is a system where the committee report can be filed away and placed on the table of the parliament, the end of it, end of the show. And the following year, they are summoned, the vice chiefs are summoned and asked what's happening, and the story is the same. Therefore, this is nothing new that has happened, number one. Number two, if the system is faulty in its constitution, then obviously you will not have sufficient feedback to thereafter manipulate the budget. Now, on one hand, look at the irony. On one hand, we are the 5th largest budget today in the world. We have overtaken UK after the 2018 budget, $62 odd billion. On one hand, you're saying we have crossed this threshold and we are the 5th largest, and we are saying we don't have enough money. So someone asked, I think, Arun Prakash in the interview, what is happening? You've got $62 billion on one hand, we're the 5th largest budget in the world, and you tell us that nothing is moving. This is the cumulative effect of neglect over a period of time in making up shortages which should have been timely. All the services are required to give a long-term perspective plan. They cover a 15-year period, they cover a 10-year period and a rolling plan, and every year we have surprises with the budget because till the last day you really don't know what you're going to get. Now this is a very dysfunctional system of budgeting. The only person who's addressed this is Mr. Arun Singh, who happened to be a minister in Rajiv Gandhi cabinet and who left the Rajiv Gandhi cabinet because of the Bofors issue. He is a well-informed person, and he has written a paper on how to budget for the armed forces. That's the only paper that I've seen where there is enough work done on how we can beat the system. So with a faulty system and a method of budgeting which is even worse, you're not going to make up the shortages which are cumulative. Take the Navy, for instance. We were getting a share of the defense budget of not more than about 9-10%. It went up to 12, 14, 15, 16. We are somewhere around the 16% of the defense budget. But 20% is what we need. But it will be at the cost of the Air Force or the Army. So lobbying for the budget happens. And this happens in other countries too. But we have a faulty system. We have a faulty system of budgeting. And at the end of it, the cumulative aspects of neglect, particularly of ammunition, never gets addressed. So there is no point in now talking about we don't have rifles. What did the Chief of Army Staff during Kargil operation say? He said, I will fight with what I have. Yes. I didn't have enough. This is nothing new. Thank you.
Air Marshal Mahatheshwaran, my question to you is about today's crash. Just today, Air Commodore Sanjay Chauhan was on a routine training mission in Gujarat's Kutch. Soon after takeoff this morning, his flight crashed, killing the pilot. We've had several of these crashes where we've lost officers in the Air Force, we've lost pilots in the Air Force. Is this because we're not able to upgrade the equipment that we have?
Crashes, I mean, not all of them can be clubbed in the way you actually sort of raised a question on that. Certainly older aircraft, as they get, aged, maintenance becomes a problem. They do tend to throw up more problematic issues. And, one of the results is a crash that can happen. But there are many other reasons which, can also, contribute to one that, like the one that's happened today. And that's an unfortunate one. He was an extremely, very highly rated professional pilot, a test pilot, and he was also the commanding officer of the base, Air Officer Commanding. Unfortunate loss and tremendous loss to the Indian Air Force. But coming back to the point, yes, as weapon systems get old, as they get obsolete, it becomes expensive to maintain them. The life cycle cost continues to increase at an exponential rate. Plus, they throw up problems like reliability and the safety issues. So one of the penalties that a service pays in the Air Force particularly is that when you fly, and you have to fly because you don't have an alternative, and you have a very old aircraft like the MiG-21, we've been flying for nearly half a century, then the penalty that you pay for the government not replacing them in time is that the accident rates do go up. That's one issue. But more importantly, coming back to the points that were raised by the General and the Admiral is the issue of the overall concept about modernization of the military. Now, as a country, we have to be clear, because the Prime Minister has traveled all across the world. You want to project an image. You want to be considered as a great power, emerging great power in the 21st century. And all that demands a certain hard power to go with, the other strengths that you want to project. So your diplomacy can only be effective if it is backed by a hard power. Your military has to be combat capable to give that message to prevent war. In the post-1945, Bernard Brodie stated, that famous statement, from now on the purpose of the military is not to fight wars but to prevent wars. And that you can only do by sending out a very credible message on your capability. And when we talk about giving a defense budget, which is abysmally low in terms of 1.58%, and then you also raise concerns saying that much of it goes into the pay and pensions, I think we are missing the complete issue with respect to military capability, military strength, and of course the defense industrial capability within the country. Pay and pensions are part and parcel of any employment. If you want to reduce those commitments, it has to have a long-term strategic plan on how you address military service, how you bring in short service commission as a bigger chunk of your manpower, and then the larger principles with respect to pension plans and pension issues in the whole country, not just in the military but everywhere else. So that is one part of it. But if you leave that aside, the amount of money that you cater for modernization process is what is, there's one element of revenue budgeting, which is about maintaining your equipment the way it needs to be maintained. And of course, the modernization process, which comes through capital acquisitions and the capital outlay that's been earmarked for it.
Right.
When you now actually procure equipment for replacement of old obsolete systems, it also has a committed liability over the years, because nothing gets finished within 1 year. It carries on for next 7, 8 years, or maybe even 10 years. And that procurement is a continuous process. So when you do that, your committed liabilities tend to increase.
Yes.
If you look at Indian defense budget, particularly for the Air Force and the Navy, over the last 10 years, your committed liabilities have increased from 60% to 92%, 95% in the last couple of years.
So I want to pull up
just about 7-8%.
Yes, I want to pick up the next question from what you said. You said the military should be combat capable to send out the message that we will prevent, that we're capable and we will prevent war. And here's my question to the panel. Are we combat capable right now? Or like Admiral Bangara said, we're going to have to fight with what we have? Would you, in your assessment, for example, Lieutenant General Shekhar, tell us, would you say that we are combat capable right now, at this moment in our country?
Well, the answerability, the accountability of the armed forces is that you fight what you have. You cannot wait for the date. You cannot wait for the time that you will fight the war when what you will have. You have to fight. That's why our chief had to say, I was a Lieutenant General, Corps commanding entire China front during Kargil war, so I know what exactly we have gone through. You cannot wait, so you will have to respond. But is that the proper way of defending your nation? Because Musharraf knew exactly where your weakness lies, and he hit upon you where you are not prepared. So that is point number one. Secondly, you mentioned about the preparation for war. In Indian context, you just mentioned about the pay allowances and pension. Indian army is highly mountain warfare oriented army. No other army in the world. No other army in the world. No other air force in the world. So it is a manpower intensive things you will require. But let me make one point clear for your consideration, and you can carry out a research on you things. To sustain the armed forces of India, which are approximately 15 lakh, there were 7.5 lakh non-competent people. 7.5 lakh. 13% of them are traveling in air-conditioned car. 13% of them are sitting in the air-conditioned offices in Delhi, Hyderabad, everywhere, other places, and they are claiming that we are supporting the army. What rubbish we are talking. We have and all this money goes from defense budget. So we have recommended, the expert committee has recommended, cut on these people, cut on these people, cut on this flab, and you will have enough money for the modernization of your armed forces. But as on today, we will not say that we will not fight a war. That will be the last thing the Indian Army can ever do, or Indian Armed Forces will ever do. We will fight. But is that the way to fight a war? I leave this question to you and to your audience. If you wish to prevent a war, Air Marshal said, be prepared for it. Admiral Bangara said, if you are not prepared for a war, you will get sucked into the war, as we have got sucked into the war number of times. At the place, time, and the circumstances will not be of your choosing. Right. And you will be all the busy retrieving the situation.
Maruf Raza wants to respond. And gentlemen, I'm opening this up to rebuttals right now. It does seem like you are not going to disagree with each other, but it is a conversation. So please feel free to disagree if you want to. Maruf Raza had his hand up. Mr. Raza, please go ahead.
Yeah, Faye, you know, there is very little one can disagree with such a distinguished panel because they're all seasoned veterans and they're hands-on. I mean, I followed their careers in great detail, so I know exactly where all they've been, and because they speak with a lot of hands-on experience and understanding. But I just want to build up on 3 or 4 other points. You know, everyone has given a quotation, so let me also throw in one. The famous British military historian, Sir Basil Littlehart, had said that if you want peace, then understand war. Now, from that I lead to my next point, and which is that our political leadership, unfortunately, has never understood what it takes to be a soldier and understood the security requirements. It is a Nehruvian legacy, and I'm talking with some authority because I've studied civil-military relations in some detail, that a Nehruvian legacy often to appoint people both at the minister's level and at the bureaucratic level with very little understanding of the dynamics of the military machinery that India has. We have some of the finest fighting men in the world, possibly the finest. We have some of the finest pilots in the world, and I have myself seen certification given to the Indian Navy by, and the Economist quoted that, the Indian Navy operates to NATO standards, so you don't have better standards than that in the world. So we've got a first-rate military. Unfortunately, they've been given short shrift by giving them not enough, the right equipment, not enough time to prepare for it. Do you know something? That any piece of equipment that's approved today will take 3 to 5 to 7 years to be inducted into the military. And if you start the process of identifying what you need, you add another few years. And that's why critical equipment will probably come the military's way after 5 years or even more. The second point to understand is that while China is an adversary and Pakistan is clearly an enemy, if China does have a military adventure against us once again, and there is a possibility brewing, let me warn this country, because in North J&K, the Chinese aggressive muscle flexing because of the Belt and Road Initiative could lead to that. The Pakistanis will certainly exploit that advantage, and whether we like it or not, we will be faced with a two-front war. So your question, are we prepared, and what kind of capability do we need to have? The military has reduced its requirement from a 40-day intense war-like planning situation down to a 10-day intense battlefield scenario. 10-day intense means you should be firing 3 times the military ammunition and weaponry that you would normally fire in a slow-moving combat situation. So we are just about scraping the bottom of the barrel, and the country needs to know that the military is not asking for money to throw big parties. It's asking for money to defend your land. Otherwise, your economic swan song and the whole story of your economy booming is going to go for a 6 if your country is not secure enough. These things that are really worrying. Forget about pay and allowances that will keep coming, and this is on par with all government services.
Maruf Raza, and I'm quoting out of the committee report here that said the possibility of a two-front war, like you rightly just said, is a reality. and speaking about it. It is important that we are conscious of the issue and we pay attention to our modernization, filling up our deficiencies. And here's my question now to the panel. Admiral Bangara, I see your hand go up. There is a lot of rhetoric that's happening right now, a lot of nationalism and patriotism that's tied into our armed forces, a lot of pride. But are we honestly paying enough attention to fixing these problems, or are we just going as a country from year to year, allocating some budget and, like you said, living with the inadequacies that we already have? Admiral Bangara, please.
One or two things I need to point out when you say, can you fight a war? First thing is, I don't know why we keep comparing ourselves with China. Let me give you an example. If China has 5 times our budget, look at the United States. Who is the primary enemy of China? Not India at the moment. It is the US. And if US is spending $620 billion, China would say the same thing. We'll never be able to catch up with the US. We will never be able to catch up with the Chinese for another 20, 30 years. So that comparison should go. There's no question of saying that they are 5 times, they've got so many ships and so many aircraft. Just look at the Indian Air Force, which did an exercise recently. Is that a pushover Air Force? It is such a powerful Air Force, and they have given this their abilities. Similarly, the Navy did an exercise. Don't make a mistake. If we have to fight tomorrow, and our first enemy, all of us know, we have sufficient, more than enough. If you're comparing yourself with $60 billion or whatever else, the Pakistani military budget is $9 billion. So if you are talking about an immediate threat, we will give them a bloody nose. Now, if we're talking about China, it's a hypothetical issue. That is where diplomacy comes in. The politicians are very good at it. They will intervene, make sure that we don't get into that situation, because everybody knows the imbalance. It is like China fighting US now. That's not going to happen. So there are checks and balances. Let's not get carried away saying, can we fight? We will fight.
Right. Admiral Bangara, I understand what you're saying, and I respect that. Of course, we will fight as we have done in the past. But my question to you was this. Are we as a country paying enough? And you said quite rightly that there are problems that ought to be solved. Like, for example, the question of, and this again is, I'm quoting Admiral Prakash here, who said we need to have a chief of defense staff who will be able to take decisions across the 3 arms of the forces. Are we putting enough energy into solving these problems? Or are we just going year to year, just making an allocation and forgetting about it? And by that I mean the government, not the armed forces.
No, now you're... Yes, now you're talking about the recommendations of the Arun Singh Committee report, or Subramaniam Committee, and then Arun Singh Committee on the Defense Management. There were beautiful and perfectly doable solutions given by him. And whatever it was, change of government, the priorities changed, and that wasn't fully implemented. So you need to integrate the armed forces. You need to integrate the Ministry of Defense with the armed forces. These are priorities. Now, these can be done, and it has been done world over by democracies, by the political interventions, not by leaving it to the armed forces. Nobody in the armed forces is keen to part with his stuff. So it has to be a political decision thrust down, as it was done in the US when they became a joint integrated force, and Maggie Thatcher and UK. It is a political decision. Do we have a political system which can take a decision? My answer is no, because at the moment there's not enough knowledge on such matters in the politicians. Therefore, they farm it off to the bureaucrats. And that is where I said the bureaucrats wield power, but they have no accountability. So the structural weaknesses need to be addressed. That has got nothing to do with the immediate fighting capabilities. Of course, we should be integrated. And Arun Prakash very clearly said that you can't be fighting a war with the Navy on its own, the Army on its own. It has to be an integrated force. Those have to be addressed. Partly, we were moving in that direction, I think, with this new committee. That needs to be watched, but no longer can we postpone such decisions.
No longer can we postpone. And I saw Air Marshal Mahatheshwaran's hand go up as well. So my question to you is simply this. Are we prioritizing this enough as a country? Is our government prioritizing this enough, both in time and energy and funds?
Well, I mean, I handled the LTIPP and the issues for nearly 2.5 years. Let me put it this way. In terms of an operational philosophy, the services have clearly indicated how, it needs to be, defined. And there is an arms op directive which defines very clearly what are the tasks that the military needs to meet. So in a way, the national security strategy indirectly sort of defined to the military. And the LTIPP then defines what is the capability that we need to have to meet those objectives and tasks. So the government has turned around and said, yes, we agree with this capability requirement. But the only thing is whether you're going to get this within 15 years or 30 years depends on the resources availability. And that's quite logical with every other country. I mean, all countries do that. So it's fine. So in terms of prioritization, that is where you need to actually define what is critically important, what is something that needs to be developed over a period of time, and that prioritization, I think, is an ongoing process. But I come to the main issue. The main issue is that while you articulate this and you ask the military to do the LTIPP and you do the long-term projection of capability requirements in the context of threat environment analysis and the strategic perceptions, everything, all that is done on paper, but in practice, do you really follow it? There comes the problem. And as Admiral pointed out, and I go back to Maruf Raza's observations in this entire issue, here the fundamental issue is that much of your political leadership does not have military experience. They have to depend on the bureaucracy. Much of the bureaucracy doesn't have military experience. But I don't blame either of them, because as a nation, you haven't built what I call as a national military culture. And that is, does every young man first want to make a choice that the military service is his first choice, and has the nation built policies accordingly to ensure that most people first aspire to serve in the military, and that's looked up as the most important thing. However short, 3 years, 5 years, has that been brought in? Most great powers, most great countries have actually brought this factor as a major important factor in nation building and building a national military culture. That is significantly absent in our country. You have no political leaders who ever want to send their children or want to serve in the military. Majority of your parliamentarians don't even bother to, make an attempt to serve in the military in their younger days. And same thing goes up for anyone who wants to know. All the civil services, training academies are flooded with enormous amount of people. I asked the question because I deal with some of them. I said, have you ever bothered to actually first opt for attempting to join the military? Even that attempt is there. So I think all that finally, the problem of not prioritizing military capability with the due respect that it deserves comes from this fundamental core problem in the country as a whole. And secondly, I also agree with Admiral. You don't have to compare tanks for tanks and aircraft for aircraft and number of soldiers for soldiers with respect to China, Pakistan or US and India.
Yes.
But each country defines its own requirements. And here you need to actually be very clear as to what that requirement needs to be maintained at all times. So if you look at China, when they were quite economically weaker than us in the 60s, 70s during Mao's time. They followed a strategy of what is known as strategy of weakness, and they said, we will fight with what we have.
Yes.
And as Deng Xiaoping came and modernized the state, then he changed the whole statement to say, we will get what we want to fight with.
Yes. So,
right?
Yes.
That's the change.
That's
so
the change.
China has leapfrogged. That is the lesson we need to pick up. I'm not saying you are copying or doing everything with China. China has addressed its strategic requirement with respect to its global positions, with respect to its threats. And that is what we also need to factor. If you look at China, it's catapulted between 89 and now in plugging all the gaps in its aerospace capabilities. There are 6-7 aircraft on the drawing board at any one time. There are aircraft carriers on the drawing board at any one time. Its defense industrial base is massive. They plugged the complete gaps that they had. They were far behind us in the 70s.
Yes, I can see Maruf Raza put his hand up.
Defense industry
completely. Yes, Maruf Raza. Obviously, and I echo what the gentleman is saying, nobody's asking whether or not we're capable of fighting. Is it fair really to put our forces through it and not give them the attention that they need in terms of fixing the problems we have? Maruf Raza.
No, absolutely. That's a very valid question. And the fact is, I've hopped on it twice in this discussion today. that, you have to identify what you must have and what you could have.
Yes.
And again, what is a most likely scenario that you're going to face and a probable scenario, and then build your capability around that. But there's another important point. You see, all the P5 powers, and we talk about India's great power ambitions, and people have written about it, and Bharat Kannad's written the book, Why India is Not a Great Power Yet, in brackets. And there are lots of shortcomings in our system, but one of them which is there is that while we talk of Make in India and indigenization, we are seriously lacking in a number of areas there. Also, all the P5 powers, the 5 Security Council members, they have a fairly robust military-industrial complex, some of them too robust for their own good, so therefore they don't want other countries' military-industrial complexes to take on, because they will not be able to sell those high-tech weapons. Say, for instance, how the Americans and the others push to weapon systems to be bought by India, because we are having the dubious distinction of being the world's largest importer of weapon systems. So we have to really understand that if national security is important, then how do we do the mix and match? You're not going to turn into a Make in India giant overnight. It's going to probably take decades. And there is a whole graph that is there. People know it. All the distinguished members in the panel, they've probably talked and written and played with that whole idea for a long time to come up with the most viable solution. But really, what worries me, and that's the point that Admiral Bangara made, and again Air Marshal Mateshwaran. See, Admiral Bangara's point is a very important point. That the thing is, you need to have a clear understanding of your national direction that you should be headed towards, and unless that is defined clearly, there is no going to be interlapping of capabilities. So the Air Force buys an X amount of helicopters, and the Army buys the same type of helicopters because it wants to have an air wing of its own. So we don't end up judiciously spending limited money that is available to spend. And the second thing about a military culture, fine, you don't want civil servants and others to go through the heat and dust of soldiering, but what you can certainly do is create greater awareness about what India's military requirements are and our capabilities are. Unfortunately, for most people, the only war that India fought, and I have no disrespect for all the gallant men who died there, but the only war they understand and know about was the televised war, which was Kargil. There is no greater understanding about what sacrifices were made after independence. There is no understanding about, can India really be the cog in the main key player that America wants it to be in the Indo-Pacific whole narrative that has begun to emerge from the shores of Africa to the shores of America. India can. But are you willing to give India that capability beyond making speeches? That's the big question.
All right, my last question before I wrap up, and we're running out of time, is to Lieutenant General Shekhar. Yes, just 1 moment. Lieutenant General Shekhar, my question to you is this. There has been, like I said, a lot of rhetoric, patriotism and nationalism to a point of Siachen mein hamare jawan khade mar rahe wahan pe, this whole Vande Mataram and how we should all love our country. And while that is all hot air and talk and rhetoric at this point, has the government done right by the forces? Has the government, put the forces and put defense first and actually been fair in its treatment so far?
Well, the effort is being made. As I mentioned, the expert committee, of which I was the chairman, when we submitted the report, and things are going, all the issues which have been discussed today in this panel have been covered, including strategic command, CDS, and all these things have been done. The point is, the moment this report was submitted, they scuttled the issue, implementation, saying that, oh, this is not the charter which was given. So there are inbuilt hesitation, there are blocks within the organization, particularly from the governing mechanism, not the government, but the governing mechanism, because they think that tough will be taken over by somebody else, number one. Number two, despite all these inadequacies, let me assure you, and through a channel, your armed forces will come up to the expectation from them. But at what cost? And at their own cost. That is the point to be taken note of. But nation can feel that their armed forces will never let them down. No wonder, no point, what price we have to pay. But is it worth it? Is it worth? We are expected to be a powerful nation, Indo-Pacific and so on and so forth. Last point on this issue. There are a number of countries will join us in Indo-Pacific region. No other country, no other army can help us in protecting our border on the line of control with Pakistan and the line of actual control with China. It's only the Indian Army, supported by the Air Force, will have to fight. No other army. They are not prepared. They are not mentally tuned up. So therefore, our requirements will be totally different. But we will make sure that we don't let down our own people.
Well, gentlemen, I've run out of time, and I want to thank each one of you for being so kind and generous with your time this evening and being patient enough to explain this to us. A group of very young civilians at Miranao who spent the evening and the last several days reading up in preparation for this particular show. In conclusion, viewers, it's come down to simply this. Obviously, we sleep soundly at night knowing that our forces will never stop at anything to keep us safe. But is it fair that we cut our budgets for bulletproof jackets? Is it fair that we cut our budgets for rifles? Is it fair that we don't give the armed forces, all three of them, the kind of money they need in order to do their jobs well? What does that do for morale? What does that do? What kind of message does that send out? And there was one thing that everyone unanimously agreed on this panel, and they're all very, very high-placed voices. They said that there are systemic problems, big problems, that can be fixed, and the solutions are on the table. They can be fixed. All we need is political will that seems to be missing. And the reason why we're bringing this show to you tonight is so you realize that the next time any politician gives you completely false nationalist rhetoric, saying, say Vande Mataram to be a true Indian, you should remember that if you really want to be proud, there are problems that need to be fixed, Mr. Politician, back in your office. Get back in your office and fix those problems. And in the very least, we need to put people who understand defense in charge of decisions of defense. That seems to be a simple, general knowledge, common sense solution that we still haven't come up with here in India. 70 years down the line, we still have politicians and bureaucrats deciding for our defense when they're not qualified and they don't understand what they're doing. We appeal to the government of India to hear these extremely prominent and eminent voices on the panel today and pay attention to what they're saying. Thanks for watching.